Our last two speakers in this session will move the discussion to the pharmaceutical sector in two different ways, specifically reviewing the effect of globalization on the body as related to the testing and marketing of essential medicines. Adriana Petrina, which I'm glad to reintroduce and welcome back to the new school, is Edmund and Louise Kahn Term Professor in Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. Adriana and I met several years ago when she used to be on faculty here, so it's nice to have you back. Her research addresses the social dimensions of scientific knowledge in the context of crisis and in the U.S.-based pharmaceutical research arena. She is author of Life Exposed, Biological Citizens After Chernobyl, and the co-editor of Global Pharmaceuticals, Ethics, Markets, Practices. Her book, When Experiments Travel, Clinical Trials and the Global Search for Human Subjects, explores patient protections in the context of global clinical trials. And today she'll discuss evidence and insecurity in the global clinical trial.
Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be back. In this talk, I consider some of the emerging geographies of capital and power that enable pharmaceutical firms to strategically move their research enterprise into different parts of the world. I want to show how reigning definitions of vulnerability and governing rules are often out of step with the competitive logic of global clinical trials. In charting this logic, I want to point out some gross asymmetries of knowledge existing between subjects, the public, and the research enterprise, and that undermine patients' abilities to make reasoned choices as to how best to pursue their health. First off, it is important to note that offshoring of trials is not merely about opportunism or exploitation. Drug companies annually invest almost $500 million in clinical research in the Czech Republic and Poland. Trials have moved to Poland because of available technical expertise, English proficiency, and high rates of untreated cardiovascular disease. Czech Republic is a hub for colon cancer studies because it has one of the highest rates of colon cancers in the world. Data from trials will be used to gain approval in drug regulatory agencies, mainly in the U.S. and Europe. Dr. Stanek, a public health specialist I met, has spent the last 2 decades transforming what he calls non-competitive health infrastructures into competitive clinical trial markets. He got his start in the early 90s, creating a minimally functional clinical trial platform built as it was on an ailing but still functional universal public health care system. He said, for companies, it was cheap. They got good data quick. There was a need for services, and all of a sudden, Western companies realized the huge potential here. There was an extremely good population pool in terms of medical indicators. We had many untreated populations. There were steroid-naive, statin-naive people you could hardly find in the U.S. or Western Europe. We had extremely high recruitment rates, unquote. Trials were simple to launch in those early days, he said. Quote, if a Western company was involved, its researchers just drove across the border with experimental products. No one cared about the contents of the investigations. No ethical committees on site. The Minister of Health's signature was very simple to get, unquote. This experimental order, however, has a predictably limited shelf life with a distinct beginning, middle, and end. First, the opportune moment, the gold rush described above, and when most Czechs could barely afford new Western medicines. The state was not able to pay for them either. The second phase of the clinical trial life cycle, the peak moment, arrives when experiments become a normal part of healthcare delivery. With the inflow of trials and human and financial capital, governments foster a culture of regulation and compliance, however soft or simulated that culture might be, but with all the expectation of supporting commercial work. Then a moment arrives when these markets become exhausted, the third state. At this state, he noted, quote, trials start to migrate eastward to Ukraine, Russia, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, unquote. There are too many firms competing for investigators, and investigators begin to charge the equivalent of Western European prices for their expertise and recruits. Stanek conceived of subjects as being only temporarily loyal, and after a while they no longer see the immediate advantage in participating in trials. People begin to access drugs from state institutions or pay for them out of pocket. For example, he told me pools of, quote, steroid-free asthmatic children in the Czech Republic are starting to get exhausted a little, unquote. At the point of increased competitiveness for the right kind of patients and investigators, and when regulations start to be less flexible, he said, quote, it simply becomes too expensive for us, just like in the US, Western Europe, and Canada, unquote. Prior to the demise of this experimental environment, and always thinking ahead, the research industry starts up sites elsewhere, moving eastward in this case. According to Stanek, the Czech clinical trial market has less than 10 years left. In the end, the globalized clinical trial floats away, transforming public health into a privatized mosaic of interests and judicial anarchy, as in Brazil. Stanek's colleague in Poland told me how the value of patient data is measured in industrial terms. Each world region's productivity, he said, is viewed in terms of output of clinical research units, or CRUs, which is a measure of labor intensiveness involved in the monitoring of one trial subject. In that formula, the value of the subject is multiplied by his or her disease complexity and complexity of monitoring. One patient in an oncology study is like two patients in a respiratory or simple hypertension study. Alzheimer's is very expensive to monitor, thus the relatively high CRU and high financial reward for recruitment. Poland is still trailing behind the U.S. in terms of CRUs, but it is ahead of Latin America by 5 years. But what drives this movement of the research enterprise, and what happens when there is no one left at home? In my book, I looked into the workings of a global clinical trials industry and its day-to-day foot soldiers, contract research organizations, or CROs, as a telescope into the global clinical trial and how it is made to work in different settings. I worked in Poland and Brazil, two regions whose aggressive neoliberal policies delivered high social insecurity amid acquiescing states. Emerging in the early 90s, CROs became a specialized industry focusing on subject recruitment and clinical development for drug firms mainly. While drug company growth has leveled off somewhat in recent years, the clinical trials industry has boomed. Why? To fulfill U.S. regulatory demands, larger number of patients, including children, must be included in trials. Some drug categories are expanding, and in the words of one executive, quote, when a therapeutic class gets hot, it's like a cattle stampede, unquote. Also, the pool of human subjects in traditional Western markets is shrinking. Quote, treatment saturation, unquote, is making us increasingly unusable from a drug testing standpoint. Our bodies, saturated with treatments, produce too many drug-drug interactions and are less able to show specific drug effectiveness. The dominant business model of drug development is plagued by diminishing returns and a loss of surplus-producing energy. That the statistical bias reduction strategy of randomized control trials, the presumed gold standard for research, is not only applied but also circumvented, is by now a truism. As one scientist told me quite skeptically, quote, in my recruitment, I can use subject inclusion criteria that are so limiting that I can engineer out the possibility of adverse events ever being seen, or I can demonstrate that my new drug is better by engineering up a side effect in another drug by doubling its dose, for example. That is the big game of clinical trials, unquote. The serious big game, organized episodes of risk in which players retain significant amounts of moral discretion outside formal rules and regulations, can involve flawed recruitment strategies requiring ever more high-risk populations. The game is also incredibly inefficient. Trial sponsors seek unexplored territories, and they turn to intermediaries to supply endless laboratories for the sake of the drug approval experiment. Enlisted physicians can enjoy remarkable degrees of latitude here, particularly in countries where medical malpractice laws do not exist, to hold off on treatment in order to produce the right kind of undertreated patient, or in the words of one scientist, quote, to bring non-existent patients into existence, unquote. CRO workers whom I knew of such transgressions and blamed the pharmaceutical profit model and tried to minimize their occurrences where they could. Owing to protocol bias, systemic flaws and unaccounted for harms are being generated within what one scientist called the paradigm of expected failure. Nested in the overestimation of drug benefit is the underhypothesizing of harm, and the paradigm of expected failure keeps trolling for new environments that can absorb or neutralize those harms. What economist Albert Hirschman termed slack over 4 decades ago, the fortunes of the research enterprise are closely linked to the handling of more or less permanent pockets of inefficiency and neglect. This slack, in turn, creates its own effervescence, ever more specialized niches for other entities to enter into the clinical trial food chain. All this management of slack and harm occurs not because of any glaring gaps in existing regulatory structures. Experiments are touted as social goods in materially impoverished contexts in which they now function, and there are significant disincentives for investigators, for example, to flag the risks of any given protocol. This sort of action may result in an unblinding of the study or its suspension, which might mean no future contract. The principle of containment and of monitoring risk, once captured in the idea of the randomized control trial, is lost in the global clinical trial's peculiar locomotion. So what we have is a research enterprise marked by numerous gaps between clinical research and public health priorities, often with significant duplication of research, with no party arbitrating the value of these trials in terms of their medical necessity, and in which a level of tolerable risk is always a locally, ethically variable decision. You also have patients who can be at the mercy of a self-regulating industry which is fighting against its own decline, signaled by pseudo-filings in the patent law, endless price increases, and so forth. In my book, I write about the origins of this pattern movement of global trials, which have their root in part in the industry's response to ethical scandals and new regulatory rules in the U.S. For example, the first phase of offshoring arguably began after wide-scale prisoner testing in the U.S. was denounced and severely limited. An estimated 90% of drugs licensed in the U.S. prior to the 70s were first tested on prison populations. In 1980, the use of prisoners for particular phases of testing was finally banned, and the industry lost a major source of volunteers. But by then, it had shifted a good deal of its research elsewhere. By the 90s, and after the floodgates of globalizing research opened wide, several scandals here and abroad around the selective reporting of negative and suppression of negative data and the misuse of medical authority reflected a competitive landscape that was clearly getting out of hand. In 2004, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors noted that selective reporting of trials does occur and that it distorts the body of evidence available for sound clinical decision-making. But the problem wasn't just about selective reporting, but about a dominant paradigm that overdetermined drug value and obfuscated risk. Also, there was still no uniform way of registering trials. With a cherry-picking of data that the world's lab afforded, one can imagine that the number of trials, either unfinished or with negative findings that were not submitted to the FDA and hence not counted, outnumbered those that were registered. Today, patients searching existing databases like clinicaltrials.gov for trials still cannot obtain relevant safety information on prior research. At the same time that transparency was being pushed, the WHO began to devise plans for a trial data bank which aimed to register all trials and to get some sense of the sheer number of global trials. The International Clinical Trials Registry platform sought to provide a public record of the health problems being studied and the countries where research is underway, and to identify the intervention, key criteria of subject inclusion, sample sizes, and anticipated results. The industry, no surprise, resisted this attempt to uncover a strategic landscape of ongoing trials. Reveal the target sample size in a given location, and you give competitors the chance to identify proprietary aspects of protocol design and the statistical powers needed to achieve a desired outcome. That was the argument. As the debating wore on, and as the industry began to sense its weakening position, it ratcheted up the argument against disclosure, claiming that this requirement would, quote, undercut the sovereignty of worldwide regulatory authorities empowered to make value-based decisions for their citizens, unquote. Lawyers not only complained of potential intellectual property theft, they branded the WHO initiative as being out of legal bounds, unquote. We must be assured that external entities working outside the law do not act to disrupt the economic basis of our industry, unquote. The industry's reaction did not surprise the WHO team. What they found startling was the lack of response from major regulatory bodies, including the FDA, which, according to another organizer, quote, only says that it is bound by regulation and that the law does not allow it to be open, unquote. If there is something like sound evidence-based medicine and an idea of universally valid knowledge as a public good, it better have a database that is capacious enough to capture some of the minute and multiple decisions that are leading to bad outcomes. As expanded clinical research redefines the terms of public participation in private sector research, here are some recommendations. First, national regulators and investigators need to ensure better patient protections up front. In some cases, issues such as continuity of treatment after the trial and the control of patient data by trial sponsors, points generally not anticipated in contracts, need to be addressed. Also, clinical trial data should be treated as a public good. Its value from a public health perspective cannot be underestimated and must be scrutinized. Regulatory oversight must be coupled with innovative legal strategies that would make drug companies responsible for trial and drug safety in a direct manner no matter where those trials take place. Critiques of intellectual property regimes have been critical to promoting treatment access for AIDS therapies especially, but federal support for health technology assessment and comparative effectiveness studies need to be strengthened to offset a high-cost pharmaceuticalized form of care. In 2007, the Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services published a report highlighting the Food and Drug Administration's failure to provide adequate oversight of trials in the U.S. Writing in response, bioethicist Arthur Kaplan asked, quote, how can it be that we know how many pigs, frogs, rats, and monkeys are used in research and who uses them without knowing what is going on with respect to human beings, unquote. Public knowledge of what is going on inside the pharmaceutical research engine is limited. The ethical labor is divided, responsibilities are over-delegated, and the risks keep getting shifted to those who don't want to flag them. We need to see trials not only as part of science, but as operative environments that actively redistribute resources and risk. The net effect is that public health systems are focusing less on big-picture prevention and primary care and on expensive, on-patent medicines for smaller groups. Improving trust in the relationship between researcher and researched is crucial, but failures to protect polities and citizens, both in and beyond the trial, are almost assured owing to the asymmetries of knowledge I described. Thank you.
Our last speaker this afternoon is Kaushik Sundararajan, an associate professor of anthropology and social sciences who just relocated to the University of Chicago. He had a previous appointment at UC Irvine. Initially trained as a biologist, his current work uses a political economy framework to examine the techno-scientific markets on a global scale and the actors involved in shaping the nature of the life sciences. He is author of Biocapital, The Constitution of Post-Genomic Life, a multi-sided ethnography of emergent genomic research and drug development marketplaces in the United States and in India, and Biosocialities, Genetics and the Social Sciences, Making Biologies and Identities. His talk today is Property Rights and the Constitution of Contemporary Indian Biomedicine, Notes from the Glivec Case.
Thanks very much, Katayun, and I want to add my thanks as well to Arian and Roberta. I realize that I'm keeping you all from Saturday evening in New York City, so I'll just jump right in. So in this paper, I draw upon an exemplary case surrounding a patent on the anti-cancer drug Glivec in India in order to trace some aspects of the political economy of global pharmaceutical development. I begin by providing some context about intellectual property regimes in India. In 1970, the Indian government enacted a patent act that allowed only process and not product patents on pharmaceuticals. This meant that one could not obtain a patent on a drug molecule itself, only on the process by which it's made. This was a spur to India's pharmaceutical industry, which became experts at reverse engineering generic drugs. This also led to India's drug prices becoming amongst the lowest in the world. It is important to note here that this cost effectiveness was because of free market competition. Indeed, India is one of the few countries where the state plays virtually no role in providing therapy to its population. India does not have a program of nationalized health insurance or a functional system of government-imposed price controls on drugs. In 1994, subsequent to enormous pressure from the United States, India became signatory to the Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS Agreement, which became institutionalized under the aegis of the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 1995. This involved instituting a 20-year product patent regime as exists in the US. In this new dispensation, one could prevent other entities from making a patented drug through alternative methods. India had to institute this new product patent regime by 2005. As of 2005, any drug developed after 1995 would be subject to a product patent regime. Any drug developed before 1995 would still be subject to a process patent regime under the 1970 Act. In the meantime, between 1995 and 2005, India was required to provide for provisions for exclusive marketing rights, whereby companies could get market exclusivity on a drug that might, after 2005, be eligible for a product patent. Glivec provided the first case where the modalities of how a new patent regime would be interpreted came into question. So developed by the Swiss pharmaceutical company Novartis, Glivec is used in the treatment of chronic myelogenous leukemia, or CML. It turns off the signal of a protein, BCR-ABL, known to directly cause the cancer. It has been shown to be considerably safer and more effective than conventional therapy for CML. The core molecule that would subsequently become Glivec is called imatinib. In 1993, Ciba-Geigy, which subsequently became Novartis, filed for a US patent application for imatinib and its pharmaceutically acceptable salts. Imatinib is the free base that has a potential therapeutic effect. However, the salt form of imatinib, imatinib mesylate, has greater solubility and bioavailability. The beta crystalline isoform was developed as a drug. In 1997, Novartis filed a patent application in Switzerland on beta imatinib mesylate. This was developed by Novartis as Glivec and approved for marketing by the US Food and Drug Administration in 2001. So basically what you need to know is in 1993 they had a patent on imatinib. In 1997 they had a patent on beta imatinib mesylate, which is an isoform of the salt of imatinib. As the TRIPS mandated product patent regime had not yet been instituted in India, 10 Indian companies started making generic forms of imatinib mesylate as soon as Glivec was approved for sale in the US. Novartis therefore applied for exclusive marketing rights, or EMR, on the drug to prevent them from doing so. The cost of the generics ranged between 4,000 and 12,000 rupees per patient per month, which is approximately $100 to $300 at the time. Novartis's price for its medication, on the other hand, was 120,000 rupees per patient per month, approximately $2,700, which was the price at which the drug was being sold in the United States. In other words, essential life-saving anti-cancer medication that was already being sold to patients in a competitive marketplace at cost was now being made potentially less accessible to them through a policy instrument that provided a market monopoly on the drug to a single company. The controversy surrounding the EMR led to active debate in Parliament about the implications of the new patent regime on drug prices, leading to provisions in the 2005 TRIPS Compliant Patent Act that would temper a product patent regime with public health protections. A crucial provision to mention here is Section 3D. This holds that any new form of a known substance cannot be patented unless it shows significantly enhanced therapeutic efficacy over that substance. This is meant to prevent evergreening, a common strategy in the United States in which companies make small modifications to their products and then claim a patent on the modification as a new molecule. Once the new Indian Patent Act had been passed, Novartis EMR on Glivec was no longer valid, but the company was eligible to file for a product patent, which it did. I won't go into the details of the patent case for reasons of time. Suffice to say that the patent application was denied by the Indian Patent Office in Chennai on technical grounds. Specifically, that a patent had already been granted to imatinib in 1993, making this a drug that under TRIPS only qualified for a process patent, that imatinib mesylate was already anticipated in that initial patent application and hence was not a new drug, and that Glivec, therefore, was just a modification of an existing drug, could not be patented under Section 3D. Novartis responded by taking the Indian Patent Office to the Madras High Court in May 2006, disputing both the denial of the patent and the very constitutional validity of Section 3D, thereby challenging sovereign legislation of the Indian Parliament in a court of law. At this point, the case came to be about much more than the denial of a patent on a single molecule, and led to popular political mobilization in India against Novartis, what was referred to as the Drop the Case campaign. In June 2007, Novartis lost the case. I won't go into the details of the verdict, but will suggest that this kind of adjudication, where rights, in this case property rights, come to be at stake and potentially reframed in the context of emergent co-productions between the law and life sciences, is an example of what Sheila Jasanoff has referred to as bioconstitutionalism. The court, in providing its reading of constitutional provisions to protect public health in the context of a patent regime, provides the forum whereby logics of global capital expansion in the pharmaceutical arena can be potentially interrupted, and also sets up alternative interpretive possibilities for how patent regimes might actually function on the ground. Yet the reasons for doing so were largely technical and procedural, not ethical or political. So I now want to move back in time to examine some of the issues that had earlier come up around Glivec in the granting of exclusive marketing rights, or EMR, to Novartis for the drug. Novartis was granted EMR in 2002 and thus was able to stop 7 of the 10 Indian companies that were making generic versions of the drug from doing so through court injunctions. In response, a group called the Cancer Patients Aid Association, or CPAA, filed a writ petition in the Supreme Court of India in 2004, which challenged the granting of EMR. CPAA is a charitable organization that has, for nearly 40 years, aided cancer patients in India by procuring medications and distributing them at low cost. The challenge was never adjudicated upon since the 2005 Patent Act was passed in the meantime, rendering the EMR null and void, but the issues raised are important. CPAA petitioned against the granting of EMR on Glivec on the grounds of right to health and equality enshrined in the Constitution of India. CPAA was also suggesting that an EMR is an example of a pure monopoly which goes far beyond the potentially monopolistic tendencies involved in upholding a patent regime. One of my interests in the larger project involves exploring how a patent, which in principle is designed to serve a public function by providing incentives to disclose invention, in fact ends up serving monopolistic functions. For this, instruments such as EMRs provide crucial via media. By providing an interim facility in lieu of a patent that is purely monopolistic, it skews the very normative value systems at the heart of patent protection away from public interest towards private and corporate interests. Novartis defended itself in a counter petition to the court by pointing to its programs of charitable drug donation. Even monopolistic entities, in other words, can make drugs accessible. It becomes very important then not to see drug access simply in terms of whether drugs are made available or not, but also to understand the terms that underlie different modes of making the drug available. I elaborate upon this with the following figures. CPAA, through its procuring mechanisms, ended up helping 30 CML patients by procuring discounted medication. Even then, they had to turn, and this was discounted generic medication. Even then, they had to turn away approximately 300 patients who had come to them for the medication. In other words, even generic imatinib mesylate does not address the problem of affordability of the drug for the large majority of people who need it. And yet, what a patient that was procured a drug by CPAA would pay in an entire month for the generic drug would have to be paid for by a single capsule of the patented medication. CPAA's calculation was that with monopoly rights for Glivec in place, 24,000 CML patients would die per year, leading to approximately 120,000 what they call preventable premature deaths over the 5-year period of EMR. One sees here a particular resolution of attention between public interest and monopoly rights, resolving into matters of life and death. The state acts as a biopolitical mediator, in Michel Foucault's words, making live and letting die. But the monopolistic functions of intellectual property lead to what the CPAA petition refers to as, to quote, the relative deprivation of access to health between those who can afford to live and those who cannot afford and die, close quote. There is a stark poignancy to the fact that in India today, affordability refers not just to consumer goods or luxuries, but to life itself. Novartis' counter-petition, however, claimed that the suffering of cancer patients was addressed proactively and on a larger scale than anything CPAA has done through Novartis' drug donation program, the Glivec International Patient Assistance Program, or GPAP. Novartis claimed that 3,638 patients had been helped by GPAP in India and more than 9,000 patients worldwide. In India alone, it was claimed that more than $76 million worth of Glivec had been distributed free. These figures suggest how complicated questions of drug access actually are, even if one goes by numbers. After all, the 3,638 patients that Novartis had helped as of April 2005 was considerably larger than the 30 patients that CPAA had been able to procure generic imatinib mesylate for. Hence, if one is simply looking at how many patients are able to get access to the drug, then Novartis was likely able to make the drug accessible to people in India as much or more than anyone else. This is partly because Novartis was not seeing India as a primary market for the drug. Its stakes were in maintaining the price of the drug in India so that it could protect that price in its more lucrative Western markets. In other words, logics of selling dictate against Novartis making Glivec affordable in India. But logics of giving make it reasonable for the company to donate the drug free. In that sense, Novartis could afford to give away free drug because it was not going to make money off those patients anyway. Indeed, it is monopoly that allows Novartis to switch Glivec out of a market economy where differential pricing does not make sense to a gift economy where philanthropic donation does. I argue, therefore, that a certain kind of structural terrain gets set up through these debates where free market competition on the one hand is opposed to a combination of monopoly and philanthropy on the other. Monopoly provides the conditions of possibility for philanthropy, yet at the same time, philanthropy is invoked as the ethical justification of a monopolistic regime. In the process, it might seem in either case that the market might come to look like an angel, the only question being which kind of market serves patient interests better. And yet when we go back to CPAA's figures, we recognize that regardless of whether we're talking about free market competition through generic companies or monopoly through Novartis, most patients who need the drug cannot afford it. In fact, therefore, the market in either guise does a very poor job of ensuring treatment in absolute terms. Novartis ignored the fact that even if GPAP allowed access to free drugs, it was not a part of EMR provisions, but external to it. Further, though projected as a response to right-to-life arguments, GPAP itself was not a right, it was a gift. It was not enforceable and was only continued at Novartis' will and privilege. Hence, in considering questions of access, it is essential to consider also the questions of power that go with different modalities of access. GPAP was undoubtedly generous, but it was also arbitrary. Indeed, Novartis threatened to stop enrolling new patients into GPAP in countries that allowed generic manufacture of imatinib mesylate, a threat that was directed especially against India and Bangladesh. The issues that raised around EMR are much broader than the technical issues that came up in the Glivec patent dispute. I wish to elaborate two conceptual issues that arise. The first concerns what João Biel has called the judicialization of the right to health. And the second concerns the forms of representation entailed in demands made on the state and the ways in which in the process subject positions are constructed. In his presentation yesterday, João Biel described a phenomenon of patients suing the Brazilian government for access to medicines. The critical difference between the Brazilian case and Glivec in India is that this judicialization is happening in Brazil in the context of a universal healthcare system. In contrast, in India, as I've mentioned, therapeutic access is left almost entirely to the market, the only question then being what kind of market emerges. What comes to be at stake in Biel's account are citizenship claims. This is a direct function of the state's role in mediating therapeutic access through universal health insurance. What one sees then are claims to what Adriana Petrina has referred to as biological citizenship. In the Indian context also, CPAA makes demands on the state. But these demands are indirect and have to do with circumscribing the market in a way that allows maximal access to essential therapeutics. Indeed, one constantly sees CPAA articulating its demands not in terms of citizenship, but rather in terms of public good. In the process, CPAA frames patients not primarily as citizens, but as sufferers, precarious beings who will be made to live or let to die depending on how much and in what ways the state circumscribes the rights of particular kinds of market formations. Biological citizenship is an individualized demand for inclusion that problematizes a biopolitical rationale of care of the population. Public good as it emerges in cases like Glivec, on the other hand, is an insistence on carving out a space from appropriation from monopolistic private property. This is not to suggest a clear binary opposition between citizenship and public good. Indeed, the question of the relationship between citizenship, which presumes the autonomy of the individual rights-bearing citizen, and public good, which involves the imagination of collective benefit, involves a conceptualization of constitutionalism, and I don't have time to explore that. So what I want to do is end with some reflections concerning representation, agency, and subjectivity. I do so by asking the question, where are the patients in the conflicting representation of CPAA and Novartis to the Supreme Court? I argue that both entities are only able to represent cancer patients through the language of protection. In Novartis's case, this language is direct and explicit. But even CPAA, when referring to leukemia patients, invokes the image of vulnerable and precarious individuals at the precipice of life and death who need to be protected through therapeutic access. This seriously puts into question the agency of CML patients themselves. This is not to say that such patients don't have agency. It is rather to say that the space for the expression of that agency through these judicial political battles is entirely constrained through the representative forms and forums that these battles take and occupy. What one is witnessing here is not the kind of biosociality that Paul Rabinow describes. Ultimately, Rabinow's notion, while carefully articulated and left productively indeterminate, absolutely presumes the existence of the articulate and articulating subject, one who can make claims and create productive alliances on her own behalf. It is this presumption in this case that is untenable. The reasons for this are partly empirical historical reasons having to do with the nature of patient and global civil society advocacy for access to medicines, and partly because of the fact that intellectual property arguments are so complicated in the context of popular political mobilization. And indeed, the real momentum for political opposition to Novartis in India arose because of Novartis's challenge to Section 3D, which was perceived as a direct affront to national sovereignty. The real grounds for popular mobilization against Novartis then were not biosocial, but rather post-colonial. The point at which Glivec really became a political issue was the point at which it was no longer of concern simply to leukemia patients. More conceptually, my interest lies in the ways in which biomedical subject constitution operates. Right? And since I really have to wind up, I just want to suggest this by thinking about the parallels to feminist politics in India, because I think that's important. I think of the structural parallels and similarities between the kinds of political terrain constituted around Glivec and those that have been constituted in the past around women's rights issues in India. These questions, which have invariably involved making demands upon the state, have constituted a deeply charged and ambivalent site of politics for Indian feminism, which, especially since the 1980s, has pushed for legislative intervention to securing women's rights, but in the context of the fact that the state is also a deeply patriarchal institution, so it's an ambivalent politics. So in the process, the very conceptualization of protection comes to be at stake. Zakia Pathak and Rajeshwari Sundararajan explore this in the context of the seminal verdict in political aftermath of the Shahbanu case. This was a 1985 case in which the Indian Supreme Court confirmed the judgment of the High Court order ordering the payment of alimony to a Muslim woman, Shahbanu, who had been divorced by her husband through the utterance of triple talaq. And this is really my last page, right? So a minute and a half. This created a political furor, especially amongst more fundamentalist Muslim groups, since personal law in India is supposed to be religious. A Muslim member of parliament introduced a bill to save Muslim personal law, which was passed in 1986 after the ruling Congress government issued a whip to its party members to vote for it. The verdict raised a whole host of questions, many of which on the surface are framed in terms of the relationship of the state to either secular or religious law. While this remains a concern for Pathak and Sundararajan, their analysis focuses on the way in which the discourse of protection comes to be the ubiquitous in the verdict and surrounding politics. The Muslim woman comes to be protected, but what that means is in fact polysemic. It ranges from government ministers suggesting that what is being protected are minority rights, thereby subsuming women's rights into rights of the minority community, to feminist activists demanding Shah Banu's own protection. This suggests that protection, while apparently about the vulnerable, can be discursively used in ways that frame the powerful as vulnerable. And so in this case, it frames Muslim men, who have both patriarchal social norms and patriarchal religious law at their disposal, as Muslim men, members of a minority religious community whose identity and rights come to be threatened by the courts. One sees Novartis engaging in precisely this kind of reframing, where it contrasts itself to the Indian generics industry, which it frames as greedy, profitable, and not engaged in philanthropy, and aided by patients' groups in the state. In the process, Novartis portrays itself as a victim, which has to deal with companies that effectively copy their invention while they've spent millions of dollars developing and giving away free drug to needy patients. Protection implies victimhood, but the identity of the victim can be easily appropriated. Even when framed in relation to the vulnerable, protection sets up a certain structure of representation that involves the appropriation of the right to speak for the victim. And that leads to the erasure of the actual voice and agency of the subjects being spoken for. It is striking that in both CPAA's representation and Novartis's, CML patients get reduced to numbers. For Novartis, this is the magic number of 3,638. For CPAA, it's the 24,000 patients who will die a premature death. The very constitution of subjectivity in the former case is as a recipient of charity, and in the latter case is through death. In both cases, it is simply numerical. Thank you.
So you just saw speed talking from all of our panelists in an effort really to give the last 15 minutes to all of you. So if there are questions for the panel, please again step up to the microphone so we can hear those questions.
So first of all, thank you very much for all your talks, very, very interesting papers. And my question goes to Professor Rajan. I was wondering, you're depicting, let's say, a low degree of governmentality by the Indian nation state in the realm of the drug market or access to drugs. But as, for example, Cecilia van Hollen show for Tamil Nadu, the Indian nation state shows a high or displays a high degree of governmentality in the case of population control. My question would be, first of all, would you agree with this, that there's a difference? And the second question would be, if you agree that there's a difference, would you say this has something to do with this distinction you made, that those patients, those cancer patients, are not considered to be citizens or kind of bi-social citizen, but rather sufferers? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Is this on?
It will be on in 2 seconds.
I won't answer that question because what it raises is a more methodological question, which is that it asks the question of the need for the ethnography of the state, right? In that, there are certain reasons why the Indian government has been allowed not to intervene actively in therapeutic access, and largely that's been because drugs are relatively cheap in India. So the free market worked fairly well, and so there weren't demands on the state to act. People periodically say price controls or whatever, but it's not been the locus of any kind of politics. And so I think that that's really why historically the state sort of let this be. And now there are various other reasons why it's continuing to let it be that have to do with logics of global capital and the place of the Indian state in that. But what this is really asking for is a sort of empirical, historical, and disaggregated account of what the Indian state is and what it's doing. Because I would suggest that it's too simple to say that governmentality exists or doesn't exist. The state is very, very present in all of these things. In fact, it has to be very present even in shaping its own absence, right? It requires a lot of work to not be doing something if you're a state. And what the state does do is actively frame the terrain upon which the market operates, and the state decides what kind of market operates. And so there are very active kinds of legislative intervention. So this is a poor sort of answer, but it is just to say that the state is something that has historically changed over the last 50 years in India, that that has different inflections between different political parties in power, and that also has differences between different ministries, right? So one of the things that happens in terms of drug access is that both the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers, which regulates the pharmaceutical industry, and the Ministry of Health is involved in policy making. And as it happens, for some reason, while the Ministry of Health is very active in making clinical trials policy, drug access policy is made entirely through intellectual property protection, and so it's Chemicals and Fertilizers and the Commerce Ministry that's involved, right? So there are different parts of the state that are at stake here.
This question is for Professor Solici, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Obviously, or not obviously, but it's a fact, I think, that DNA is absolutely specific, so that if you find someone's DNA at a crime scene, then they've been there. The one question I have is, you don't find a little packet with a label DNA on it or the person's name attached to it. You get this substance and you put it in electrophoresis and you get a little blip, a curve, and you have to match this curve with the curve of the known quantity. How accurate is the actual test itself? I mean, how much room for slippage is there in interpreting what often appear to be not very distinct experimental results, as opposed, you mentioned instances where it was deliberately fabricated, which certainly occurs, but I often wonder, is it really it's true, if it is the DNA it's said to be, then maybe 1 in a million, but how likely is it to be actually the DNA that it's said to be based on the chemical analysis?
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we know for a while now that it has been a lot of cases have been when the storage of the material has been highly problematic, and that's been a case for forensic scientists for a long time. And the cases where which I was describing, some of the cases actually, one of the Dr. Pamela Fisher actually involved she changing the theory what kind of a blood type it was. I was going a little bit quickly. Her research first showed it was blood type A, and then she literally changed at the trial into blood type B, which matched the person accused. So literally, a lot of the cases actually were in the notes. From the notes, you literally had to believe the notes of the expert witness, and whatever he was handling, the material he had, often it wasn't double-checked, or sometimes material was a bit damaged, and sort of the theory was just kind of made up. And so at the Innocence Project at Cardozo School of Law, at first, they were, helping people who are on the death row with sort of finding, the kind of the old samples and doing DNA analysis, which didn't exist before. Now more and more are, the cases which unfortunately are called bad science. So the cases I described are not perceived as kind of criminal cases, but sort of bad science, mistakes which happen out of often being overworked. So when I started looking at it, and I started looking at it when I was working on biobanking, and that was sort of related to a big EU-China project, which we had for 3 years, BioCenter in London at LSE. Nicholas Rose was in charge. He created something which was called BioNet, and we were 21 partners in EU and China, and sort of going back and forth, trying to figure out how to regulate this enormous market, which sort of everyone was talking about, from organs to data and so on. And there was such optimism exactly into having these fantastic banks. And then, there is very little literature on forensic biobanking. Actually, not much, and my surprise was how optimistic most of this is. And that's why, just by coincidence, I started thinking, where is the human factor? And doing work in the domain of psychoanalysis and law, otherwise I was thinking, what if you have a scientist who finds enjoyment in convicting? And here I'm not only talking about DNA, but other samples too. And more now research comes out that psychological testimonies are highly problematic. The so-called Munchausen by proxy symptom, because of which a lot of women are still in prison. Accused of killing their children. Even last week, New York Times had a magazine had a big cover of the new research about the shaken baby syndrome. And, the authority of expert, that's my problem. So if I tell you now that broccoli causes cancer, you will not believe me. If I say that the best Harvard Institute for Broccoli Studies did a controlled trial, and I give you some data, 80% of people supposedly will believe, the biggest, then real success will be if I have pictures. So the new studies which I'm doing in the domain of neuroscience and law are fascinating. You need to have only picture and an expert, and the belief is enormous. If you have an expert without a picture, it doesn't work that much. Pictures now are called Christmas tree effect. Yeah. The pictures of the brain where something is lit up. And the more I research, I rarely see that two neuroscientists would agree with what those lights really mean.
Could I ask if your question was about the statistical validity of the test? Sort of beyond the human dimension? Because there are actually rules. Yeah.
What I really mean, though, is electrophoresis, you put the
Yeah.
substance in the field, you have an electrical
Right.
charge, and the molecule migrates.
Yeah.
So you have to interpret it. What I'm really trying to say, trying to ask is, how much room is there for variation in the interpretation?
Right. Well, I think Renata actually got at that very well, because she's saying that there's a human who's doing the interpretation. If you were to actually, just put the data there are actually statistical calculations that you can do. But I think her point is very much that there are humans involved in these cases that are either making the data fraudulent or interpreting it incorrectly. Yeah. 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 The actual error of the DNA evidence has changed over the last 20 years, so the statistical chance of finding two people by coincidence is quite low. We look at 13 different hypervariable regions. So it's usually actually error that is either deliberate or, as Renata said, because you're overworked, but I'll put that in quotes. Yeah. Sorry.
My question is actually for Professor Vance. I liked your list of what not to do. And I have a question that is about where does trafficking start and stop? I'm co-director of Global Action for Trans Equality, which is a transgender human rights organization, and we find that a lot of trans people are working in the sex industry, mostly for survival reasons, but also for hopes of gaining enough money to access surgeries and hormone treatment. What we also see is that quite large numbers of trans women from countries in the global south, especially South America and Asia, work in countries of the global north in the sex industry in the hope of gaining that access to surgeries and hormone treatments, and traveling to those countries with high hopes of bettering their lives, only to find themselves coming from one system of oppression into the next. So I would like to hear your ideas about where does human trafficking start and stop? Is this a form of human trafficking, or is this another system of oppression? So.
I teach a class on trafficking, and my students are always very disappointed to learn what both these laws, U.S. and international, actually say. They're both carefully crafted not to include what I call garden variety exploitation, or garden variety structural victim of structural conditions. So trafficking, perhaps not as you might like it to be, is very narrow, and these three elements I referred to before, there has to be a method, which can be force or persuasion or threat, for the purpose of putting someone in a position of motive, exploitated labor. And what's especially interesting in the UN protocol is that many terms, are defined: slavery, slavery-like conditions, etc. There's no international law or in the convention offered definition of exploitation. But considering the countries that signed, there's a clear understanding that exploitation refers to a very extraordinary degree, a very heinous degree of exploitation. So the conditions you describe, that people are economically disadvantaged, that they migrate either by being smuggled or legally through visas to go to a wealthy country to make money, to gain something that they want for themselves, surgery, would not be considered trafficking.
It would be considered medical migration. That's the term that's used for what you described.
Well, it seems to me if they're migrating to a more wealthy country to engage in sex work, medical migration, there may be an objective of saving money for a medical procedure, but it's not so direct.
First, I want to thank you for really an extraordinary panel. It was incredible. And the question that I have partly comes back to the discussion with Professor, again, I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Solecho. And I'd like to ask you to be in conversation with Professor Osorio. And I know that today you chose not to focus on race, but I was struck by the analysis of the idea that the dynamic to pay attention to in terms of the forensic genetic databanks is a dynamic of perversion, of individual perversion among scientists who draw some kind of pleasure from falsification. And what I'm concerned about is the way that that pulls attention away from the broad patterns where, in fact, it's clearly dynamics of race and racism and other kinds of xenophobia that are both built into the genetic databases in certain ways that we need to understand and acknowledge, but that also provide the motivating logics usually for when is it worthwhile, when is it exciting, when does it make sense to someone to step outside of the bounds of the evidence as they see it in order to nail the usual suspect. I mean, that's one way to put it. I want to just briefly mention, so this idea of what kind of human error or what kinds of errors, one of the things that we need to know about the dynamics of creating a forensic DNA match, for example, has to do with what's the population that you're comparing a particular sample to. And Professor Amada Macharik at the University of Amsterdam does incredible use with this in looking at the sort of mobile calculation of somebody's probability of guilt depending on the background population from the suspect and how that travels with suspecting Arab identified suspects in certain communities. So this is a long question comment, but I wonder if there's a way in which the two of you could talk about those dynamics and how they're built into the technologies themselves as well as the human motivations that you're focusing on.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important question, and it would be important to look exactly, in regard to color, how many of these men, especially of the case that I have looked at, this Zain, and I haven't yet come to enough information about this to be able to say something, and also that it is mostly rape cases. Now, an answer that I got, especially from people in Innocence Project, is that actually it is mostly rape cases because mostly there you use the samples, and that's kind of where most forensic work is done. Now, in regard to race, yes, there is a really dangerous field emerging, the analysis of so-called warrior gene. Some of you have probably know that in analysis about predisposition for criminal behavior, especially in New Zealand. There is this research that, that Maori population has a warrior gene. Now they are already using the epigenetics theory, so they are not saying that you have a kind of a gene inside you that replicates itself, but that your genetic make has changed because you have been oppressed for 160 years. And you had to self-defend. That's why you became more violent in self-defense kind of way. But you're then more violent, and majority of their population in prisons is Maori. That genetics and race has been used actually strangely in a positive way. In a recent case in Trieste, an Algerian man was tried for murder. First he got 9 years. Later he hired a geneticist who claimed that he was genetically predisposed for violence, and his sentence was lowered. That's the first case in Europe that the genetics had kind of, let's say, a positive way. Of course, all the geneticists who reviewed the case, there has not been any study of Algerian population and their genetic makes, and it would be completely, probably pointless to make it, but I'm saying that there is like a slight turn also in another direction. But thanks for a very important question.
So I would just add that the point that how race comes into this is in the idea that all over the world, depending on sort of where you live and where you were born and where your ancestors were born, that there's a sort of non-random patterning of genetic variation. And when you look at the genetic profile in a forensic sample, something that was left at a crime scene, the experts are trying to make an estimate. What is the likelihood that this sample found at the crime scene, having matched some sample in the database, what is the likelihood that that could come from two different people as opposed to the same person? That calculation may be affected by how often you think a particular marker is going to be in the population. So then the question is, what is the population that you're comparing to, from which you're drawing these statistics? Where does the denominator come from? And it's interesting. In the United States, the forensic database that the FBI keeps it's partitioned into African American, Anglo-American, I don't remember if they have a Native American partition. It turns out they have two Hispanic partitions, and I actually asked, I was just sort of curious about this. I said, Hispanic is a really quite varied ancestral group of people from really different parts of the world. What is this Hispanic database? And the person from the FBI told me, actually, we have two, one for the East Coast, essentially, and one for the West Coast, because the West Coast is capturing ancestries of people who came from Latin America and migrated northward, whereas the one on the East Coast is capturing ancestries of people more from the islands and from different parts of Latin America. Okay, so first of all, the interesting thing about the racial partitioning is that it was impelled by defense lawyers who questioned the validity of statistics if those statistics were given from the overall U.S. population. And so it was because of that the FBI felt that they needed to then divide their databases by race. Now, of course, these stratifications they're not random. They're based on socially salient categories in this country. They don't map neatly onto the varieties of ancestral of ancestries that people have, or the whole very complex varieties of genetic patterning, if you will, that are found in this country. I frankly think that, especially in this day and age, they could merge all those databases together. They could have perfectly valid statistics, but now we've got a practice going on that involves this intense attention to race. We also have people disproportionately represented in the databases, so based on the laws of whose materials can be included, who gets arrested and who gets convicted, of course, there's a disproportionate share of DNA from African Americans and Latinos in the database, right? And so if you're going to use the database to try and catch people, who's likely to get caught? And that is only magnified when we allow for familial matching, where the match from the crime scene sample and the match in the database don't have to be perfect. They can be partial, but when they're, so in the United States, as someone said, we use 13 markers, hypervariable markers. So if you get a match on 10 of those markers out of 13, it's essentially always going to be a very close relative. It's so unlikely not to be that some states are allowing law enforcement then to go out seeking the relatives of somebody who's in the database, right? And so again, this idea that if you have, not everybody is sort of represented in that database in proportion to their share of the population, then it sort of concentrates law enforcement activity in certain racial groups.
Okay. That's a good place to end. I want to thank all of our panelists in the afternoon session and all of our panelists for the entire conference. I know that there were many questions that might not have been answered, and many of the panelists felt that they had to rush through their talks. I just want to remind everyone that all of the papers will be collected for 2 different issues of the journal Social Research, which is out on the tables. So if you're looking for further information or you want to get more information from each of these presentations, please look forward to that issue. Arian, did you want to say any closing remarks? No. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and your interaction.